It's a great pleasure to welcome back all of you to this live session at Best Ideas 2014. I'm so happy about this session because we got three exquisite minds with us to discuss the topic of investment checklists, something that's just so crucial in scrutinizing potential investment ideas. And so while the rest of the conference is about specific ideas, this session is really about learning and about improving our own investment process. With us today we have Mohnish Pabrai, who needs no introduction. He runs Pabrai Investment Funds, has done so for quite a few years with amazing success, and follows a strategy that seeks out undervalued companies. He really is known in the industry for having a process that involves an investment checklist, and so we look forward to talking about that and getting his perspective. Also joining us is Spier, my Zurich-based friend and successful value investor in his own right, who runs Aquamarine Fund. We also have Michael Shearn, who founded Time Value of Money and is the author of the excellent book, The Investment Checklist. So we really have the panel of experts here with us today. I want to leave as much time as possible for their insights, so we'll kick it off in just a moment. I also just want to remind everyone that you can ask your question at any time by typing it into the online interface. And with that, maybe I'll just open the floor by mentioning that Mohnish just a few minutes ago held up his investment checklist, and while I politely requested to see the checklist, I think we're going to hear excerpts and thoughts about the process of constructing a checklist. So maybe we can just go to Mohnish to get us started, and Mohnish, you could talk about how you even got to realizing that checklists were of such importance to your investment process.
Well, John, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's also a pleasure to have Guy with me in Irvine. It's wonderful, and of course the topic of checklists is something that I don't need too much cajoling to talk about. It's something that's near and dear to my heart. But just to give you a little bit of kind of history and backdrop, really the pioneers of the usage of checklists is really the aviation industry, and if you look at aviation today, it is ultra cheap and ultra safe, and those two attributes are directly a result of usage of checklists. So the kind of modus operandi I followed in trying to create an investing checklist was to really look at the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, and the way it deals with airline safety and such, and I use that as the approach towards building a checklist. And just before I go to the FAA, just if you go back a little bit further, Boeing had produced this bomber, which they wanted a large contract at that time from the Army Air Force in the United States. And so they were pretty much a shoo-in to get the contract, and they had arranged for all the Army top brass to come and see a demo flight. And when this B-38 took off, it promptly kind of kneeled on one side when it got a few hundred feet off the ground, and then crashed, and with casualties and so on. And that was the end of Boeing getting that contract, and Boeing had invested a huge amount in that airplane. So they went back and analyzed what went wrong, and this was a very complex airplane, and they came to the initial conclusion that this was too much plane for a person to fly, in the sense it was too complicated. But then Boeing really kind of drilled down on the problem, and they came up with what was the first aviation checklist. And they basically, to assist the pilot said, okay, before takeoff, here's the set of things you need to do. And while you're in flight, here's the next set of things you need to do, and so on, for landing and so on. And they convinced the Air Force to give them another try. And of course, the plane flew flawlessly, and subsequently, in fact, they had virtually no crashes which were unrelated to being shot at during World War II. And so that plane performed magnificently. It was called the Flying Fortress. And from then on, checklist became very fundamental in aviation. But the way the FAA kind of goes about looking at airline safety and flight safety is, on a steady state basis, the FAA really does nothing. They really get going when there's a plane crash anywhere in the world of any significance. And when there is a plane crash, they send their experts, the NPSB gets involved, and so on. And the main thing they're focused on is to find out exactly what caused the crash. And they spend ungodly resources to get to that answer. They also have an approach which is very pragmatic. So the FAA has a certain price per human life, and that goes up every year. It's indexed for inflation. Last time I checked a few years back, it was about $3.5 million per person. So if there is a plane crash, like for example, you can look at that crash on the Hudson where all those flying geese hit that flight, they're able to model what the probabilities of something like that happening are. And in fact, in the early 1960s, there was another airplane that crashed, and what happened with that plane was actually it got hit by a bird or a few birds in one engine, and then shrapnel flew out from that engine and then actually destroyed the second engine and even the fuselage. It actually caused damage in the fuselage, and that plane crashed and no one survived. And when they had that crash take place, what the FAA did is they studied the problem and they mandated a number of changes in the way aircraft engines were going to be manufactured in the future. And they actually required the aircraft engines of the future to not throw out any parts when it ingested a bird. So it could fail, in fact it would fail, but it would fail in a manner which would not threaten the rest of the airplane. And birds hitting airplanes pretty much happens every day. It's a very common occurrence. We never hear about it because there isn't a crash, because there's still at least one good functioning engine, and it works out fine. And so the Hudson crash was not just bird but Canadian geese hitting the airplane. And again, they look at it and took a pragmatic approach and try to figure out the odds and probabilities. And my guess is they will probably put more rules about how airports can control birds around airfields and that sort of thing. So anyway, the approach that the FAA takes, which is you send in people to examine a crash and then figure it out, is exactly the way I built the investment checklist. So the equivalent of an investment crash is when you have a permanent loss of capital. So I said, why don't we try to find a whole bunch of value investors who had these permanent losses of capital, and then once we see a permanent loss of capital, ask ourselves a question: was it obvious before the investment was made that there was likely to be a problem with the investment? Something that was visible before the investment was made. So kind of looking at it like kind of the P38 model, which is investing is a a multivariable type activity with a lot of different factors going into the dynamics of the future of a business, and one can easily get swayed with the upsides while ignoring some of the red flags. And so this was a way of kind of building a list of red flags to look out for. And so I looked at Warren Buffett's mistakes, Charlie Munger's mistakes, Longleaf Partners, Third Avenue, Slep Carman, David Einhorn, and so on. And I had an intern help me build the checklist. And what we found is that in almost all cases, it was very obvious before the investment was made, what was a very significant, I would say, blind spot that the investor, some great mind, actually didn't think about. And so as we saw these mistakes, like for example, the easiest ones are Buffett and Munger because they talk about most of the mistakes. So things like Dexter Shoes, Berkshire Mills, US Air, NetJets, and these types of businesses, diversified retailing and so on. We were able to start to put together some questions about what had caused the failure, and then we went to other businesses, other investors. I also looked at my own mistakes, obviously, because I had a full data set. And with some investors, they don't talk much about the mistakes, so there was a exercise of trying to reverse engineer, and sometimes we could and sometimes we couldn't. So if we couldn't reverse engineer it, then we just left it alone, but the ones that we could, we did, and I went about basically just building a list of questions. So for example, when we saw the failure of Dexter Shoes, the question that came up was, is this a business that can be negatively affected by cheap foreign competition or cheap labor in overseas locales? And sometimes we had issues with businesses, with unions, with something like US Air. The airlines have multiple issues. You've got a duopoly of suppliers, you've got a duopoly of engine manufacturers, you've got unions, and then you've got pricing set by your dumbest competitor trying to cover marginal costs. So a number of different checklist questions that come out of that sort of a business. And we just went around one by one and looked at the list, and I just started building the list, and eventually the checklist now has about 97 questions on it. And what I found so remarkable was that they fell into some very nice categories. So, for example, I have the checklist here with me, and this is the one I ran before we made the investment in Chesapeake Energy. And it goes on for a few pages, but that's because we've got all the mistakes below every question. But there's a very neat section. So the first section is on leverage, and leverage doesn't have a lot of questions, but it has the maximum number of failures. So all kinds of different issues with lots and lots of great minds, missing things related to leverage. And another area is management and ownership, and that has a number of different questions. Things like, it has a senior team and CEO been together for a while. Will the death or departure of a CEO have significant impact? That sort of thing. And then the next one we get to is on moats and basically competitive advantage, sustainable competitive advantage. And then we get to business valuation as another area. And then finally there's a catch-all, which is a small group, which is kind of personal biases. So we made all these list of questions and then reorganized it by subject. And so they basically fell into 5 broad categories. And I think checklists, just like in aviation, we have such a low rate of air crashes and fatalities in crashes, and checklists are to a large part responsible for that. So they are a tool that gives you, they carry a lot of weight without adding a lot of burden. So for example, typically when I run the checklist the first time when I'm looking at an investment, it's actually the last thing I do before making an investment. It usually takes no more than 15 or 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes max to run it. But the first time I run it, it actually pops up all sorts of questions to which I don't know the answer to. And that's, I think, the biggest value addition, which is there are these blind spots that I had completely ignored. So then I go back and research the business some more to get answers to those questions. And sometimes that can take a week or longer. And then I rerun it a second time. And then now the second time when I run it, we've got all the questions answered, and we can see the possible failure points. So there are no businesses that will get a clean bill of health on all 97 questions. That's not going to happen on pretty much any business. But it demonstrates very clearly what are the issues that could possibly cause a problem, and it forces you to think about it, and then to try to weigh in your mind the odds and probabilities involved of those sorts of events coming to pass, and then you can make a very kind of sensible go no go decision. So I've been using the checklist for about 4 years, and I would say close to 5 years, and it's been a lifesaver in the sense that I think the error rate, and of course it's a short period of time to draw conclusions, but the error rate at Pabrai funds over the last 5 years is almost non-existent. I think there have been only 2 situations where we've had a permanent loss of capital. The total amount of capital we lost in those 2 situations was $5.5 million out of more than 500 million, 600 million investment, somewhere along that number. So kind of less than a 1% ratio of loss. I'm sure the loss ratio will go up in the future, but that's a really muted number. And then out of the 5.5 million, 5 million was a loss on one investment which was based in Egypt, and we lost money there because there was a revolution, and there were kind of very extreme kind of stresses placed on this particular business. So actually knowing what I know even today, I would have still made that investment because that was a kind of an outlier factor. So really the checklist I think has been remarkable. I think I'm very thrilled with the fact that I was able to add this to our arsenal, and I think it's a significant advantage for investors.
Great, thank you, Mohnish, for that. Maybe, Guy, you could add to it perhaps by, there's a question actually that I think is interesting you could help us address, and that is whether you use a checklist after you've already done significant research and then you use the checklist basically as a tool to verify that nothing is missed, or whether you use a checklist as a skeleton that guides you through the entire research process. So maybe you could talk a little bit about kind of the significance. Is it really more of a preventing mistakes, or is it the process itself in a way?
I just feel lucky to have been included in the research portion of Mohnish's work. So if you look through the checklist, he got all my mistakes, and we went through them, and there was a relatively complete data set there. I guess, there's a shopping list of the things that we would like, and that in a certain way could be a checklist. And if you go shopping, your wife gives you your list of items and you go down them. I would argue that this is something very different. It's not about remembering anything. I don't know if you, John, or any people watching this have had the experience of reading a text. And I've had the experience of reading a text, and then I suddenly realized that I've skipped a whole paragraph, and there was something in the paragraph that I skipped that was important, and I need to go back and reread it so I get the full meaning. And we've all had the experience of reading a book and then rereading it and learning all sorts of new things that we didn't read the first time. And it just seems like our minds have the capacity to jump things, and we all do it. And when it comes to all sorts of elements in life, it's probably fine. But when we're deciding to commit a huge amount of capital to something and we don't want to lose money, we want to try and prevent our minds from doing that. And the checklist is not a fail-safe mechanism, but it's like Granny's rule. We eat our dessert after we've had the main course. It's a way of trying to interrupt that natural skipping that the mind does. So that's a long answer to your straightforward question, which is there are all sorts of ways to find good investment ideas, and maybe you could use a shopping list approach. There's all sorts of other ways, but this is something that comes at the very end, just before pulling the trigger. And it's about trying to figure out where has my mind skipped important details that I can force my mind back and look at them.
I want to see if we can go to Michael as well and get his perspective, because I know, Michael, in your book, The Investment Checklist, you advocated for checklists as a tool for going through all the stages of the research process. So maybe, Michael, you could talk a little bit about how you approach checklists in your book and what you see as the key benefits of a checklist.
Sure, we use it, you know, kind of like you said earlier, as a skeleton, really to value a business, because the questions are helping to guide us in understanding what the stability of the cash flows or the earnings are of a business, and how they're likely to change in the future. So, you know, we use it very much as a tool to value a business and to help us gain a perspective of we kind of want a holistic view of a business, you know, instead of just looking at it from one aspect. You know, we can look at it from a lot of different angles. So one of the big benefits I'd say we have found as far as advantages, it's a great feedback mechanism. So, you know, as we answer the questions, and you get a kind of a written report of where you've gone wrong in your analysis of a company. You know, what you probably overlooked, or what you need to look at again. So, for example, one of the issues we had that we discovered through looking through our checklist on a lot of multiple companies that we used it on was we continually underestimated the operating leverage of businesses. So, in other words, the impact that fixed costs would have on the revenues of a business. So, for example, you know, we would say that if there was a 10% drop in revenues, there would be only a 20% drop in earnings, and the reality was it'd be closer to a 60% drop. And so it allowed us to really find a weakness that we had for a long time, and continue to refine it, because, you know, really a checklist to us is just, you know, it really just enforces the application of every lesson you learn. And so we use it for those two purposes. One is you know, the value of the business, and the second is as a feedback mechanism.
Great. Well, maybe, Mohnish, you could talk a little bit about how you use checklists after an investment has been made. Let's say you mentioned Chesapeake and the checklist you used when you made that investment, and then there was management change at Chesapeake, other things are moving around. Do you go back to the checklist, and if so, how often do you reevaluate a business? Sorry, Mohnish, I think you are on mute.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, so so far we haven't gone back and rerun the checklist after we made the investment when there are changes and such. But I am tracking the business, and I'm not tracking it, you know, in minutia on a day-to-day basis, but usually every 3 months or 6 months, I'll do an update. And I mean, with Chesapeake particularly, I think, you know, the thing is the cast of characters that had come on board on the board of the company. You know, you had a Carl Icahn representative, you had Lou Simpson, you had Longleaf Partners and such. That is not a cast of characters that's going to just be, you know, shrinking violets on the board. And so I expected that that governance would get a pretty careful look and solid overhaul, and even management would be put on a straight and narrow path. So I don't know exactly how things would play out, but you know, we understood that there were issues there, but we understood that there were dynamics in play that would probably work out just fine. And such. So in that case, I think we ran the checkers. We had a set of red flags, and then we were comfortable enough looking at the kind of the full spectrum to plunge forward, and I think it'll work out for us.
And you know, on Chesapeake, you mentioned the leverage items on your checklist. Obviously, Chesapeake passed those tests. Can you give us an example of a company, or just discuss how a company would fail your leverage items on the checklist?
I mean, I think the leverage items, you know, you want to look at. In fact, I'll just go through and see. Obviously, you know, the questions on leverage, you know, talk about, first we're just looking in general at whether the business is levered in the first place, and then second is, you know, what are the covenants and all of that, and then you know, recourse, non-recourse, and those sorts of things. And so obviously I did scrub that fairly hard on a business like Chesapeake, and you know, in the end we felt that that it was a pretty reasonable. The company was, still is significantly leveraged, but you know, winding down that degree of leverage, and so that's okay. But they've been, I think maybe Guy, you can think about, they've been many businesses we've looked at where the leverage has given us pause. I forget the name, but we were looking at a East Coast waste recycler, Citrella or something.
Florida.
No, in the Northeast. You know, I think they had some tailwinds from all the fracking and such, and we looked at that. I think you've forgotten anyway, and you know, it was showing up on Value Line as very cheap and such, but the leverage in that business just gave me heartburn, if you will, and so I liked many elements of the business, but basically we just didn't want to go there because so. I think the number of businesses that I pass on because of leverage issues is pretty large. I think that one of the things that I've learned even outside of the checklist now is even before I run the checklist, I think I know that there's been all these failures that have, you know, deeply entrenched my brain on which are related to leverage, and I think that's one of the benefits of building your own checklist is that you get more it gets kind of entrenched in a better way, and so I'm just a lot more sensitive to leverage issues in a post checklist world than I used to be before.
John, here's an example that, so I think that, and this is why I think it's an important thing that, you know, taking over somebody else's checklist is not going to work as well as doing one's own checklist, because each person approaches the investment challenge differently. We all bring different proclivities and biases. So, for example, early on I found Tom Russo. I discovered this idea of GARP. I loved it. I felt like it was comfortable for me, and I found myself naturally attracted to businesses that didn't have sort of collateral value. So provided the earnings engine was running, that was great, but if the earnings engine failed, there was nothing else to catch the investment. So so that you know, the question is the value of the company backed up by some kind of easily identifiable collateral value that does not rely on just the earnings stream, is an important checklist item in my checklist, and would rule out probably a company like Apple, which does not have that collateral value. It's just the earnings engine. If the earnings engine breaks, then you don't have anything supporting it. The other element on the leverage side that is has come up for me since the 2008 crisis, it stopped me, and I can't give you specific examples, but the leverage doesn't just extend to balance sheet items. There could be elements of revenues that depend on the customer being leveraged, and if the customer cannot access the capital markets, it will hit your revenues in some way. And so again, that's an example of, those are two examples of ways in which my mind will just skip. So I will not look at the collateral values in the business because I'll fall in love with the earnings stream. And I need something to force me to not make that skip and to look at collateral values. Similarly, I need something to make me step back and say, who is the customer? How are they funding these purchases? Is this an easy purchase for them to make, or do I need to do more analysis there? Hopefully that's helpful. So I think that, you know, I have this idea that keeps coming up for me. Ultimately, good investing is an inward journey. What I need to do is look inside myself and say, where have I, what have I done? What is it about me that takes me into these businesses with no collateral value? And how do I figure out a question that I can ask myself that will prevent me from doing that going forwards? I think that's part of the effective construction of a checklist, and is the reason why it's different in every case for each individual.
We have a question.
By the way, it's such a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure.
We have a question.
Yeah, I'll just say it's a to be here. It's a pleasure to be with you, John. And this is only the second time I've been in this home office of Mohnish's, and I would tell you that there are so many elements. I think that this is true when Mohnish and I visited Warren Buffett's office. So a checklist is one element of the environment in which we conduct our work, and to have a checklist is a good thing, but it's also good to have a notice board up on the right reminding you of certain things. It's also good to have a library behind you. It's also good to have Charlie Munger staring at you. There are many ways in which we can structure our environment to improve our decision making, of which the checklist is one element of it. And I think that what I've seen in Mohnish's case, what I've seen in Warren's case, is that they will not lose any opportunity to improve their investment process. So there is this sign as you walk into Warren's office above one of the doors, Mohnish. Now I don't remember what it says.
Invest like a champion today.
You know, he's walking under that sign every day.
And in fact, that sign Warren copied from the Notre Dame football locker room, where I think all the players touch a sign which says "Play like a champion today." And in fact, he had the exact same sign made in the same. And in fact, we copied that, and I put that in my office, which says "Invest like a champion today." And so, sure.
So this guy, so Warren Buffett, one of the smartest guys on the planet, perhaps the greatest investor that ever lived, is not losing any opportunity to improve. If it worked for the University of Notre Dame, maybe it'll work for him. He's putting a sign up there. And, you know, so I guess before you ask the question, it's not a be-all and end-all. The guy who created the checklist, sitting to my right over here, is also looking for every other opportunity he can to improve his investment process, to improve his investment decision making. He's not just going to rely on his intellect. He's going to find as many ways as possible to form an environment around him that is conducive to good investment decision making.
You know, John, just to digress for a second, and I think we can bring this back in pretty quickly. But you know, I realized recently that you know, I had looked at Seagate and Western Digital. I think a couple of years back. In fact, I have an investor who's a senior engineer at Western Digital, and you know, I've had long discussions with him about disk drives and storage and such. You know, nothing about the dynamics of Western Digital in particular, but in general that industry. And you know, it was very clear that you know, that industry has been a terrible industry for a long time, but it's consolidated down, and it consolidated down to basically two players having most of the market. And in the last couple of years, Western Digital has gone through the roof. It actually, I think I haven't looked lately, but I think it would have been a 6 or 7x or something, because I think I was looking at it at 15 or something, and it's close to 85 or 90.
And now you talk about it, and now you bring it up.
No, and so there was this notion, which is a powerful notion, which is that, you know, when these really bad industry, disk drives are one of the worst places to ever invest in, because there were so many players. prices are falling, it's an industry rapid change, all these negatives. And then when I looked at Western Digital in the end, I decided to give it a pass for those reasons. But once you shrunk down to 2 or 3 players, it worked really well. And then the same thing happened actually in the airline business. And if you look at the U.S. airline industry now, which is also for longest period of time being one of the worst places to be, well, it shrunk down to a small number of players having most of the market share, and they've been able to tack on all these add-on fees, the baggage fees, and all of that, and they've merged away most of the competition, and it's been a tremendous run, and they were treated as stepchildren for a long time. So I don't know whether I would have ever gotten to the point of making an investment in the airline. And then more recently, I was listening to David Einhorn talking about Micron, which is in the DRAM business. Probably worse than the disk drive business is the DRAM business. That's a dog-eat-dog world, horrible business. And it's like Intel used to be in the business, they exited it. And DRAMs again have gone through the same process that airlines and disk drives have gone through, and it's consolidated down to I think 3 players. And as soon as it got down to 3 players, it's rational pricing and rationality. And of course, the one advantage or one common element all 3 of these industries have is they have very high capex. And especially in DRAMs and in disk drives, it's very hard to enter the business. Airlines you can still enter relatively easily, but the other 2 are much harder. So I missed all 3, and I missed them because of these biases. And so that's something that now I've added to my, you can say, my lattice worker models, if you will, which is that pay attention when you have really bad industries go through some rationalizations, because there may be, if you can actually get some dynamics there, the pain may already be gone, and the upsides can be quite significant. So so like I said, checklists are one attribute, but I think the key in investing is to be a learning machine and to look at the same data that everyone's looking at. You don't get an information advantage. What you're looking for is an analytics advantage. And just take a step back, and sometimes you can see the forest from the trees.
The question?
Question is, how do you think about pruning the checklist and removing questions that are no longer useful?
Actually, I think it's irrelevant because it doesn't take much time. There's a number of questions for a particular business. The answer is NA. It doesn't apply. So it's fine. We just put NA and just go to the next question. So there is so little time that goes into answering a question. It's kind of in the order of seconds. And that's the beauty of the checklist, is that it basically adds virtually no baggage and no overhead to your investment process, but it delivers massive return. So from my point of view, I don't see myself ever deleting questions, because we don't pay much more price for having stupid questions on there.
And there's this great part of Charlie Munger's 24 Causes of Human Misjudgments. At the end of his talk, he says to the audience, is there some element of these 24 causes which are duplicative and repetitive? And he said, absolutely. And what's the problem? Whatever way we can get at getting our minds to behave a little bit better is just fine. So we're not trying to create a sort of a beautiful, well-honed, well-constructed intellectual argument or beautiful paper, or it's a tool that works. It's a practical tool, and it doesn't have to be complete, and it doesn't have to be non-duplicative. It doesn't have to be even. All of those things are irrelevant.
Here's a question in terms of what items are most important on the checklist, and the question actually flips it around. Rather than items that you would use to avoid a stock, what do you look for the most when you're looking for good ideas?
For us, John, we spend a lot of time on management and asking questions about management, and there's actually surprisingly a lot of information out there that's accessible to you on management. For example, you can just look at the biography and the proxy statement, which is one of the first places we go to, and see how did they rise. Is this a management team that's product focused, or are they sales focused? Did they come from the corporate suite? We were looking at Cisco, the food distributor, and looked at the background of the senior officer, the CEO, and he had been previously the CFO. And most of his career had been spent in the corporate office, and so this is a business where operational details are very important, and somebody who doesn't have a lot of experience with that, so we would avoid that. So we spend a lot of time on the management side, trying to understand who we're partnering with, what's their background. Another resource that we believe is really underutilized is a source called Factiva, which is a historical article archive of articles in the Wall Street Journal or Barron's or local business journals found in communities. And what we do is we run articles on the CEO that we're researching, and you can get a multitude of ideas or track record of the CEO and stories about them. You'd be surprised, even some that are really kind of pink sheet type companies. We find a lot of articles written in local business journals or local community newspapers from that Factiva source. So we spend a lot of time on the management side, and then I think also on the customer side and understanding it. Using again Factiva, understanding how the business helps the customers, and then helping us identify new customers.
Thanks, Michael, for that perspective. Yeah, absolutely. I would also maybe pass that question on to Guy and Mohnish, and maybe ask them what items they use on their checklist to test the quality of management.
The item on the checklist that says quality of management. I mean, I just think that when investing is like swinging at a golf ball. You see so many people swinging in so many different ways, and some swings are really ugly looking, and some swings are strange. But it's the results that count, and people come at it from so many different angles. I'm fascinated to hear Michael talking about what he does. And I've been fascinated to learn about what Mohnish does. And I think that where you have to distinguish between the sort of, I'm about to pull the trigger, I'm going to run the checklist, and the investment search. And the search, I just think the more the merrier, the more sources. And at the end of the day, we've all been there. Michael was talking about following management teams. It's a great idea. There's something interesting, unusual going on that catches us, that says this is unusual, this is strange, this could have an incredible return. But exactly how that works, I mean, I would even argue that on each investment idea, that process is different. Exactly how one gets to it is different. So
yeah, one thing about investing is it's kind of I would say it's a discipline of contradictions. And the reason it's a discipline of contradictions is that on one hand, as an investor, you need to be very careful. You need to look at all sorts of things in a multitude of disciplines, and it's always helpful to be very very skeptical and such. But at the same time, you have to have a bent that's willing to make large bets. And so this this kind of seeming conflict between being extremely careful and think that all sorts of things could go wrong, and at the same time being willing to make large bets are a kind of a contradiction to have both those attributes in the same mind. And that's why I think the Buffetts of the world are so rare. So my take on the checklist is, a couple of things. One is not to try to outsmart it. So I don't want to go into running the checklist with a bias that a particular question should get much higher weightage than another question. I actually just want to run it without any bias and just see what comes out and then analyze what comes out of it. So first of all, I'm not trying to overthink that, look, we really need to hone in on this factor and not that factor. The value a checklist adds is to let it do its thing. And the second thing to remember is that we are in a field where you are going to make errors, and you are going to make lots of errors. And one should try to minimize those errors, but one is never going to get to zero errors. That's not going to happen. So, one has to be careful, but one has to also understand, like what Templeton said, that the best investment analyst is going to be right 2 out of 3 times. And if you're batting 66% or something, that's supposed to be exceptional. And so my take is that you're not going to eliminate errors. I think the checklist goes a long way towards reducing them. So that gives you a significant advantage. It goes a long ways towards highlighting things that you would normally skip. Guy talks about this notion of the cocaine brain. And basically, once we see something that's going to have massive upside, our brains kind of want to, like Guy says, skip over and not even think about things that could cause problems. And so what the checklist does is it acts like a circuit breaker and forces you to think about everything that could cause problems. So it adds huge value. But I think at the bigger picture is that you have to understand that you cannot, a great investor is not going to just be someone who's super careful and super conservative. You have to have a conservative bent with an aggressive bent. And those 2 attributes many times are diametrically opposed to each other, but you need them in the same person.
And Mohnish, there's actually a question that came in related to that, the willingness to be aggressive, and the questioner talks about how you advocated a 10 by 10 portfolio, and then maybe you became a little more cautious right through the crisis, and it seems like you're back at the 10 by 10. Could you talk a little bit about your views on that, how they've evolved, and whether you still believe that that type of concentration is optimal?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I had, to me, it just made natural sense. I really hadn't thought about it a whole lot right from the time I started practicing value investing. This is, the 94, 95 time frame, well before Pabrai funds. In my personal portfolio, I ran, typically if I made a bet, it was 10% of assets. And of course, when Pabrai funds started, I carried that on. And I carried that on till about late 2008. And we had taken very serious losses in 2008 and early 2009. In fact, the funds from top to bottom were down 2/3. So we had, underperformed the market by some significant margin. And of course, one of the things that came out of that big hiccup is the checklist. But the other thing I was looking at that time in the 4th quarter of 2008, 1st quarter of 2009, was such a large universe of great opportunities. So for example, the commodity space, we were finding so many different ideas in commodities that, and really didn't have that much time to look at them, so I took a basket approach. And I thought that being less concentrated would be helpful because we've taken large losses on these concentrated positions. And of course, so I told my investors I was going to move from this kind of 10 by 10 to sometimes even taking a 2% position or a 5% position. And of course, sometimes we take a 10% position and spread it out. And that worked fine in that 08, 09 time frame because there were so many ideas. But like Buffett says, good investment ideas are rare. And I think in hindsight, that was, you could say, a shell-shock Mohnish, trying to find every which way to figure out how to avoid another 2/3 down scenario. And as I look back, I said, that we are not going to have these periods very often where we can have, 30 ideas to act upon. That's just unrealistic to expect, except once in a long time. And so the tendency to diversify beyond the 10%, I actually started to question that. And in fact, now I'm full circle, and typically now when we make investments, it is at 10% of assets. So we've come full circle. In fact, my thinking has evolved even further. So Pabrai funds is a vehicle where the investors have signed up for a certain type of ride. And so I don't want to concentrate more than 10% because that's what we've always done, and I think my investors have come to expect that. But for example, I manage our family foundation, and there the degree of concentration is very extreme. In fact, I would say 3 ideas might make up most of the pie. And I'm in the process of looking at another vehicle, which would be a permanent capital vehicle. Hopefully we get something public in the next few days on that. And there again, the degree of concentration is going to be higher. In fact, it'll be a lot higher. It might be, again, at times where we have just 3 or 4 ideas that make up most of the pie. And so my journey is towards more concentration, but more checks and balances before making those bets. But at least in Pabrai funds, we'll stick to our 10 by 10 type model and take from there. And of course, what has happened is that the good ideas being rare and valuable, it's now approaching 19 months that I haven't had a new idea. It's probably the longest period I haven't had a new idea. And maybe part of it is the checklist. But so if we are going to go through periods which are 19 months long where we don't find anything, we can't own 30 things. That's just not going to work, and such. So that's my take on concentration.
I just two reflections, John, on that as I listen to that. One is that I find it interesting how there's no hard and fast rule. To some degree, what you saw Mohnish doing is responding to the environment. So, and maybe environments in which 30 stocks is great, maybe 2008, 2009, and there are other environments in which it is not, and one needs to intelligently reevaluate that. But I think the other thing that I have learned from observing all sorts of investors, including Mohnish, is that just because that works for Mohnish doesn't mean that that works for me or for John Miljevic or for any one of your listeners. That is the side that we don't see is the internal workings of how Mohnish's mind works with relation to ideas, in relation to the amount. I mean, we heard a little bit of it, how he approaches his family foundation versus how he approaches a vehicle in which other investors invest. And I think that what I found, and I believe very strongly it's the right thing, is I need to do what fits right for me internally. So I think that I actually, going through 2008, I promised myself I would never be more than put more than 5% of my capital into one stock. I actually found myself over the last 6 months putting more than 10% of my capital into one stock. But I am naturally a guy who is more risk averse than Mohnish is. I take losses. They impact me in a greater way. And I can get all twisted and bent out of shape over why that is the case, or I can just be accepting of that and say that I can have a perfectly decent track record and I'll live a happier life and probably make better decisions if I'm internally aligned with the way I am. So one part of what Mohnish is saying is I think it would be people should listen to Mohnish and say, okay, that is Mr. Pabrai speaking. Who am I and what is right for me? That is what is right for him. And that is probably why we saw, interestingly enough, might be interesting. I have a question for Mohnish now. If we look at the track record of the super investors, Charlie Munger had an extremely volatile set of returns, much more volatile than Warren's. Now, I would have had great difficulty with that. And do you think that Charlie was more accepting of volatility than Warren, who was more capable of it?
Yeah, well, I think, it's a good question. In fact, I had a discussion about this whole concentration issue with Charlie, I think during my shell shock years, I think in 09 or 10. And, Charlie's perspective is very clear. He says, you have to do what you are comfortable with. You cannot say that X is the answer towards the degree of concentration or not and such. And I think that's the correct answer. So I think that for the degree of concentration and the degree that one makes a bet and all of those sorts of things, I think it's individual and it's situation dependent is probably the best way to look at it. I think those are probably the best ways to go about it.
Here's a question that says, how do you avoid falling into check the box mode when using a checklist versus thinking creatively about an investment?
That's John, when I first started compiling questions on the checklist, I fell exactly into that trap where I was just answering questions to answer questions, and then I'd keep asking, to what end am I answering all this? So when I first started, the questions were geared more towards understanding a business, just having a greater understanding of the business and the management team. And I fell into that trap, and I'd say the way I got out of it is I really started thinking about, what is the purpose of answering all these questions? And again, it brought me to, am I answering these questions to better understand what the stability of the cash flows are and how they can change? So if you have a new management team entering the business, you obviously that's going to have, or could, depending on the business model, have a significant impact on the business. As we saw Ron Johnson come in with J.C. Penney, very few decisions, lost a lot of revenues there. But I think you just really have to have this purpose of, is this helping me value this business? Or am I just just answering these questions to answer the questions? So really having that purpose behind you is what I found to be a very useful tool in helping me avoid that.
I would just mention, there's that book by Malcolm Gladwell, Blink, and, the thesis is kind of sometimes you make better decisions by thinking without thinking, so to speak, or not using a checklist. So maybe tell us just kind of how you balance the rigors of a checklist and your creative impulse to go out and really find those ideas that can be 10-baggers over a few years.
Well, I think the Blink concept is not incompatible with the checklist. I think the thing is that we have, you have a universe of 50,000 or so stocks, and no one's going to know even a small fraction of them. So you're looking for something to trigger something in your brain to start research. and the number of kind of arrows you have in the quiver to research things is very limited. And so there has to be something right at the outset which is telling you don't go there and go here. So for example, for me, large numbers of stocks get rejected within 5 or 10 seconds because I just very quickly know that. And of course there are plenty of mistakes of omission that happen there, which is fine because like I discussed with all those businesses like disk drives and such, we had plenty of mistakes or omission, if you will. But I'm never worried about the mistakes or omission. I think that it's the commission one that I'm more concerned about. And so I think that the blink concept is an important one to basically help you get rid of large swaths of businesses that there's no point drilling down on. And at the same time, it's also important because something can trigger and tell you that in your gut that this is a particular business that you ought to spend time on. And so those, what goes on in your brain to cause that is sometimes kind of be difficult to pinpoint. But you need some kind of mechanism very quickly to say, yes, I'll spend more time researching something, and no, I'm done with this. And the no's have to be very fast. Otherwise, the universe that you can possibly look at will be very small.
Another question that's interesting, it basically asks how you deal with companies that may not be meeting some of your checklist items but are clearly moving in the right direction, and it may be also getting at things like the airlines or Micron or companies like that where in the past they would have flunked the checklist, and maybe even today they're flunking it, but there's positives there. Maybe just talk a little bit about that, because that's where maybe some great opportunities can be found.
I think that this is not a mechanical thing, and we just saw how Mohnish talked about his approach to concentration. He intelligently approached it. Yes, something will fail. Look, it'll fail a checklist item, but the world is a probabilistic place. But what the checklist has done is it has forced one's mind to focus on it, to assign a probability, and then taking it all into account to say, so now you're at least focused on what kind of checklist items this investment fails. And so there's no reason why one can't make an investment with a company that has failed a checklist item. We're not putting ourselves into straitjackets here. We're acting intelligently, but we're kind of, what did Mohnish call it? Bowling with
bumpers.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's cloning. That's the next webcast.
I see.
You're bringing up a different subject.
Applying one idea to a different subject. Yes. But
yeah, I mean, I think there is no company that's going to come through flying colors with the checklist. They're all going to have hair on them. That's just the nature of business, because by definition, business is uncertain. I mean, you could look like a business like Coke and break out in all kinds of hives about the whole sugar issue. And that may be benign for decades, or it may not be benign for decades. And at some point, it becomes a judgment call which way it goes.
I mean, one example, so U.S. money center banks, the fact is that they were leveraged. They had a lot of losses coming through. They had leveraged balance sheets. But so they failed, all sorts of leverage checklist items. But then you go and you say, well, wait, hang on a second, they're money center banks. There's a bank called Bank of America. Will the Fed, after having gone through all of the financial crisis, would they even want to force Bank of America to raise new equity? You make a probabilistic decision as to whether they would or wouldn't. And even though Bank of America failed the checklist item, it was a very juicy idea that was worth investing in. There's one example, and there are plenty of others. And sometimes it's nothing comes to my mind right now, but it fails a checklist item. I mean, it's an example I brought up, but I did not invest in OPAP, the Greek lottery company that ended up doing extremely well because the product is not for the greater good. But sometimes the focus on that, so failed a checklist item, is this for the greater good? Is this a net benefit to society if this company exists? Perhaps not, therefore I don't want to make the investment. But the focus on that, sometimes I've realized that the first take on that answer is actually not the right answer. There was an example of the company that makes submarines. So the U.S. defense company.
General Dynamics.
So the first approach is, hang on, this company makes weapons that create mass destruction. So, but then so it's failing. It on the face of it failed a greater good question, and then second take around, actually they create this helps keep the peace, and actually one can see it as a secure world in which these products are properly used. So the actual failure of the checklist item drives a better and deeper and more nuanced understanding of the business, and you realize it's not really a failure of the checklist item. So I hope I made that point clearly. If I didn't, I can remake it.
So make sure to use the weapons on the bad guys.
Or use the checklist.
Well, they also make Gulf Stream, so they're forgiven.
But use the checklist item to drive a deeper understanding of the business. Is this really a failure of the checklist item, or what do I need to drill down on now that I know it fails this item to make myself comfortable with this? Could I get there?
Well, we're almost out of time. Maybe one last question before we let you go, and I'll just encourage folks to also feel free to follow up if needed. Actually, if you could mute me, Guy.
Oh, sorry.
No problem. And also, I also want to mention something we're trying to pull off here. We've never done it before, so I'm hoping it'll work. Later this week, we're having a videographer visiting Guy and Mohnish at Mohnish's office, and we're hoping to get a wonderful conversation and video for everyone who is on this call, and that should provide additional insights. So before we let you go, we had a very persistent question here coming in regarding fiat, and that is whether you've used the checklist on fiat and how it did.
Well, we own fiat. I think Guy owns it as well, and it would not have been bought if it hadn't gone through the checklist. And of course the double take and triple take I did on fiat right up front when it first came on the radar was the valuation. I mean, at that time it was €3 and change with the market cap in single billion euros, still single billion euros. But I think it's pretty much a double since we bought it. Yeah, so it'll be a long discussion, but there were these aha moments that we had, which was giving us an understanding of the auto business, especially the auto business in the United States, which was different from consensus opinion, and the opinion we came up with was widely different from consensus. So and so actually that's why I made the investment in GM and Fiat, because of the dynamics and such, and understanding of the business, and of course on the checklist, the auto business in general has two big red flags. I'd say three red flags. It is high capex. It has unions, and it's taste dependent. And any one of those three can kill you. And so obviously we needed to have some perspective on each of those and such. So
I would just correct something. Mohnish says we. I don't know what we he's referring to. He's quite capable. He did all of that on his own. I was just trying to keep up with his the rate of learning on the motor industry. And you know, the checklist is no substitute for having a fine mind and a creative way of approaching the investment challenge.
Well,
but
with
I
that,
think with the autos, with the autos, I think we got to a place that we didn't get to with the disk drives and the DRAMs and such, which is a perspective which was different from the consensus and a strong conviction on that perspective.
You know, this is not checklist related, but two other things. I think that the manual of ideas had an impact in triggering your thinking on.
Yeah, actually, so John, we wouldn't have made the investment if there was no manual idea. So I had noticed that Berkshire had bought GM, and you know that went through in and out of my brain in about 5 seconds because I absolutely hated the auto business for some of the reasons I just explained, and had seen you know, the pathetic way the U.S. auto industry operated for decades. And then I think when I was flipping through the manual idea, where you know, you give updates on what everyone's been buying and such, and I noticed that David Einhorn had a position in GM. Not only did he have a position in GM, it was his second largest position behind Apple. And so the question I asked myself is, why would Berkshire, and the Berkshire GM position I was sure was one of the two new managers. And probably I thought it was Ted Wexler because it was distressed, and he did W.R. Grace and such. So I thought it might be him. And so I would say, why would someone like Wexler and someone like Einhorn, who are both very smart investors, why would they hone in on this really crappy business? And so I drilled down on GM, not from a perspective that it looked intriguing as an investment, but I just wanted to, you know, clearly understand why they made the investment, so that I was clear on why I was passing on it. And of course, as I drilled down, you know, GM kept looking better and better. And in the process of looking at GM, I looked at all the competitors, and then Fiat entered the radar and such. So all of that happened because there's the manual of ideas that makes it so easy to do that.
And so just one other point that I think is important for me, at least, is that because nobody has, so that there was some really, so Mohnish has got a fantastic investing mind, but he doesn't rely on himself. He's looking to what Warren Buffett is doing, he's looking to what David Einhorn is doing, he's looking to what Ted Wexler is doing. I think that something that I did early on in my career is that I tried to be self-reliant and just accepting that we don't have a monopoly on good thoughts, and to figure out how to get in tune with other smart people, whether it's going to the Berkshire meeting, subscribing to the Manual of Ideas, attending events like this, and figuring out what other people are doing and what insights have they had. And worth adding that David Einhorn or Ted Wexler might go through dry years where they don't have a fantastic insight, but to keep observing them, because every now and then they will, and see if we can reverse engineer it, is an absolutely key part, it seems to me, of any good investor's thought process. I don't know how Warren does it, actually. Maybe Warren doesn't need it. But is he reverse engineering anybody, Mohnish?
Yeah, I think Warren is not as low life a cloner as I am. I think he has vastly more original thoughts. But I think Warren does well. I think like, for example, his Amex investment was made because of a discussion on a golf course with the CEO of Hertz, and the Hertz CEO impressed upon him how critical Amex was to his business and how amazing the moat was. And I think Warren went back from that golf game and made a significant commitment to American Express, and I think it's basically a permanent holding pretty much at Berkshire. And but I think Warren is definitely much more independent in his thinking. I think he's just read and seen a lot more and such, and can come up with more patterns. And I think his ability to see, like, we saw that in the railroad where there was a consensus opinion and he had a different opinion, and he went with a different opinion, and it worked out really well for Berkshire and such. So that railroad today, with what they're churning out, could not be bought even for $100 billion. So it was an incredible purchase by Berkshire.
Well, with that, we are out of time. Our next session starts in 15 minutes. I want to thank Michael, Mohnish, and Guy for having joined us and for having shared your insights so freely with us. I also look forward to continuing this discussion and hope to bring all of you much more after Thursday, when we hope to have a great session at Mohnish's office, which will be recorded, and then we'll bring it to you sometime in the future. So stay tuned for that. And with that, I wish I could be with you guys in California. Guy, look forward to seeing you in Zurich real soon. Take care. See you soon.